Welcome to OIB-TAC's monthly webinars, where our presenters share valuable information and helpful resources to support professionals working with older adults who are blind or vision impaired. Let's check out this month's webinar.
The opening code is HEA. That's H as in hotel, E as in echo, and A as in alpha. HEA.
It is my great pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Ricky Enger with Hadley. Ricky, thank you so much for being with us again. I know you have a true passion for technology and helping people understand the variety of options that are out there and how to explore them and navigate through operating them. And we're really excited for you to come and share about these different devices that will help with accessing different health metrics. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I am delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be back. I'm always so happy to be invited back. And so thank you for that. So, yes, today we are talking about some of these options for accessing just different health metrics, measurements that you might be taking if you're managing a chronic health condition or just really in the process of living life. There are things that we need to be aware of about our bodies and what they're doing and our health. So, what I'd like to do today is talk about some of these options that are available both from a low tech and a high tech perspective. Because if you are looking for something to measure something, whatever it is, maybe it's weight or blood pressure, or maybe you need to take your temperature, it's pretty easy to find something off the shelf. But when you add in that the screen isn't going to be visible for you or it's very difficult to see, then choosing the right thing becomes not so straightforward. So there are some options for the low-tech user, the person who just sort of wants to set it and forget it, or that's where their skills are at the current time. And then there are some things for people who may have ventured a little further and maybe they're a bit comfortable with a smartphone or maybe they're totally comfortable with a smartphone. And so what I'm hoping to do is go through some of these and not only give you an idea of what's out there, but also answer that question of how are you going to guide someone through choosing something like this to measure whatever thing that they're tracking? How do they choose the right thing for their unique needs? So there are, I'd say, two major divisions of how we might track health metrics. And one of them is the talking products. These are kind of tried and true. They've been around for a while. They are designed for blind and low vision users, or at the very least, I think they're designed with the idea in mind that looking at a tiny screen is not going to work for you for whatever reason. They're usually pretty simplistic, right? So they're meant to do what they do on their own without needing to have anything else to interface with. And there's some really great things about talking products. Like I said, they are tried and true. They've been around for a while. And so we have just in the course of using them and teaching them kind of become aware of whatever idiosyncrasies they do have. They are generally pretty easy to use. You're not going to need to read a 4-page manual or take a 3-part course just to learn how to use your thermometer. The idea is that you pick it up, it's pretty clear what the thing does. The buttons are nice and large and tactile, so you're able to find those without a lot of struggle. And they do what they do and not a lot more. So when you're looking for something with a lot of bells and whistles, this may not be the approach for you, but it is nice to have something that does what it says on the tin, as they say. And so that is just a couple of advantages of talking products. And the biggest one in my mind really is that you're not going to wake up one morning and discover that your device is suddenly working differently than it was yesterday. When you take this out of the box and turn it on and it does whatever it does, it's going to, for as long as it works, continue to work in exactly that same way, which can be ideal for either people who are not as adaptive to change, or really if you're managing a health condition or you need to take a metric for some reason other than you're curious and you kind of want to keep track of it. So if it is your blood sugar, for instance, you don't want to be in the midst of taking this metric and perhaps your blood sugar is low, so you're not feeling the greatest. The very last thing you want to do is stop and troubleshoot why this thing isn't working. So with a talking device, that's a lot less likely to happen. Uh, because not everything is perfect, there are some cons to these as well. And one of the first ones I think about is privacy. So generally, with a couple of exceptions, you don't have a device that has a headphone jack. So whenever you step on that scale, for example, that measurement is going to be announced aloud to the household, or depending on how loud you have it, the neighborhood. And that may feel kind of problematic for you. It might be something that you would rather not have announced to the world. But with talking products, that is a consideration, is that there will be less privacy in how those things are announced. Now, thankfully, there are volume controls on most of these, not all of them. But if you are deaf or hard of hearing, along with being low vision or blind, depending on that level, these may not be usable for you at all. So you do have some creative options in that instance, depending on what your situation is. So, for example, you are um, if you are very low vision or totally blind, you can't see a screen at all, but you are hard of hearing, but you still do have some hearing, you can utilize that very loud volume button, and you may be able to hear that result. Alternatively, if you do still have some vision, you can get creative with things like taking a picture of the scale, for instance, and then magnifying that, or using a handheld magnifier to look at the screen of the device. But in that case, you're not sort of taking advantage of that talking feature, but you found a workaround to still get the metric. I think the biggest downside for talking products is that while some of them do have a memory function so that you can review past results, you're going to have to do some manual tracking. And we'll talk about a couple of ways to do that that may involve technology just a bit, but you might be doing things like brailing your results or putting them on a digital recorder or using handwriting to take down those results. And of course, the disadvantage is that it's got to be habitual. You've got to keep up with that. There has to be the decision or the habit to not only take that metric and know what it is right then, but to then note that down in some way and to have the skills to go back and review that later. I'm sure a lot of you have had instances where someone is handwriting notes and they go back to read those notes later and discover that's not quite as readable as I thought. So it's essential as you're going through this to make sure that the person has a consistent and consistently accessible way of noting down those metrics and being able to review them later. So let's talk a little bit about connected devices. There's a lot to like about these. For example, privacy is a big one. You're not going to have to worry about them shouting out that metric to the neighborhood. And the way that these work is they will connect to a smartphone or a tablet if you're maybe using a flip phone or something, but you do have a tablet that you use, you'll be able to connect them that way. And they do rely on the phone's built-in accessibility features. And what that means is not only do they rely on uh, the phone being able to talk or magnify itself or being able to zoom in on whatever is being shown, but they also rely in a way on a user's knowledge of those accessibility features and how to use them. So it's one thing to know that, hey, this particular device works very well with talkback or voiceover. But if your user doesn't know those things, it doesn't really matter how well the device works if the user can't access that functionality. So they are, again, more private than your talking devices. They are going to keep records automatically. So rather than you're needing to log that result whenever you get it from your talking device, or maybe you're looking at the screen of that device if you've got some vision, this will automatically keep the record of what you've done, both in the app for that connected device, since that's generally how these work. You get the device, you connect it to your phone, and there's an app that kind of acts as the intermediary between that device and the phone. And the app will generally have some features beyond just taking the metric. It might have the ability to track some trends automatically and that kind of thing. What's really nice about this approach is that often people need to share this information with a healthcare provider. And so rather than taking in your stack of paper or your digital recorder and playing out your trends out loud, or kind of relying anecdotally on, well, I think my blood pressure has been pretty steady, you can actually share this by showing it to your healthcare professional. And in some cases, you can even upload those records. But I think that's a little bit beyond the scope of this simply because every provider is different and the systems that they use to allow for uploading of this kind of thing is a bit different. So that's something that could be explored on an individual basis, but we're not going to get too far into that today. The interesting thing about connected devices is that they do tend to pack more bells and whistles in. So I suppose the idea is that if you're buying something, quote, smart, then you want it to do maybe a little more than just tracking that one metric. So an example might be if you have a connected scale, not only is it going to track your body weight, but it may offer additional information like your body composition. So here's what's going on with your muscle or your visceral fat or some other things that you probably don't want to know about but need to anyway. Other kind of anecdotal thing, but it has happened often enough, and I've heard enough info from enough people that it can't entirely be ignored, is that the smart counterparts tend to be a little more accurate than the talking ones. Now, I won't say they're more consistent, so you may have a consistent measurement from your talking thermometer, but it may be consistently 2 degrees off from what a clinical setting is reading. And that 2 degree difference is a big one. But as long as what you're using is consistent with itself, then it's a thing that you can keep in mind. And we'll talk a little about that later. With these smart assistants, one really big advantage of having this sort of automatic record keeping is that not only is this going to be visible in your phone's health app, but often you can use your smart assistant to get that information. And that is a wonderful thing, particularly if you're working with someone who is in those beginning stages of learning to use the smartphone. And voiceover is still a bit frustrating, or talkback is frustrating, or they're using the Zoom function and, getting lost more often than not. The need to track things doesn't end just because you're still learning your assistive technology. And so smart assistants can be a very nice addition here. Of course, there are some downsides to these as well. And that first one is that you've got to have some smartphone skills to some degree. Now, that could mean, again, that you're just working with the smart assistant, or that you are fairly comfortable with whatever the accessibility features that you're using are. That is just one layer of this. The other layer is that not only do you need to kind of know your accessibility features, you must be able to, or you must know someone who can go through that initial setup process. So the downloading of the app from the App Store, and the what button do you press to make that Bluetooth connection initially. Usually, this is something that just needs to be done once. So it's perfectly okay to say a friend or a family member, or perhaps the service provider, is going through that setup process. And once it's done, then the responsibility that the user has is know a bit about their smartphone. Now, what happens if the app fails or the phone breaks or what have you? Do you have a backup? That's definitely a downside to these. And I will say that the smart devices will also display information on their screen. So if you want to employ in an emergency some of those creative methods for getting the information, for example, maybe you're calling IRA and asking them to look at the screen of this device, or perhaps you've taken a picture and blown it up, or you've gotten out your handheld magnifier. Just a couple of options until you can address whatever the issue is with the phone or the app or the device itself. The biggest downside of these is that, unlike talking products, which are never going to suddenly betray you when you wake up one morning and, the engineer has gotten bored and said, I don't like the look of this app. We need to redesign it entirely. And it could be that they redesign it in a way that is completely inaccessible. That can and has happened with connected devices. So if you're working with someone who is, again, not super adaptive to change, or simply doesn't want to go through the possibility of that troubleshooting step, or it's a huge frustration and a huge setback to have been independently tracking something, and suddenly, through no fault of your own, the app has changed and you can't. It's something to think about. So there are lots of measurement categories that we could talk about, but since time is not infinite, we're just going to choose a couple that are pretty common that you might want to track. And I'll give examples of a talking one and a connected one. We'll have links on the site after the presentation so that you can check those out. And those links are by no means the only talking examples or the only connected examples, but they are ones that have been tested and at least of this recording do. So we'll chat a little bit about body temperature, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, and blood sugar. So we'll start with a talking thermometer. And this is the one that I've chosen from is from LS&S. And again, we'll have a link there on the site, but it's a digital oral thermometer. There are multiple types of thermometers that you can get. So there's the oral one, there's one that you can fit in your ear, there's the no contact ones that you kind of wave in front of your forehead and they do the temperature. So a couple of different examples there. This particular one speaks in English and Spanish, and it has a relatively large text display. So the uh, numbers are about 0.75 inches in height. So if you're looking at it, then you would know whether or not that's, going to work for you at that font height. And a bit of a pro and a con, I think, is that the voice on this one can be turned off. So it could be that you do that accidentally and then you need a little bit of assistance to get that back on. Or maybe you've changed the language accidentally and you're not quite sure how to get it turned back on. But in general, the operation of the device is very simple in that you put it in your mouth. There's a nice large button to speak the temperature and off you go. The connected example I have is called the Kinsa Bluetooth thermometer. And for those who can see this, it's probably going to blur out a little bit. I'm just holding it here. It's about 5 inches long. It's got a flexible end, a round top where you put like a little CR32 battery in it, and then this tiny little button on the top of it that you kind of have to press with your fingernail to turn it on. It is still fairly tactile, but it is definitely smaller than what you're going to find on the talking thermometer. What's nice about this is that it can sync to the smartphone for multiple people. So if you are taking your own temperature and you're keeping track, you're a caregiver for someone else, you'll be able to keep those measurements separate. It can sync to the health app, which is really nice. So that's automatically updated. Now, one thing I want to mention is that whether it syncs with your health app or otherwise, you can get your smart assistant to tell you this information. So we can say, hey Siri,
Uh-huh.
what was my body temperature today?
As of 12:11 p.m., it was 97.88 degrees Fahrenheit.
So there you go. So with the smart app, you can ask your smart assistant to tell you this. What about the talking stuff, though? If you are looking to still keep track of this kind of thing, but your knowledge of your smartphone is sort of using that smart assistant, you can say, hey, so and so, hey, smart assistant, log my body temperature. And if you speak that phrase, it will ask you, okay, what was it? And you can provide that information. Now you have a, somewhat tech involved way of keeping track of that. And because it's in your health app, you would still be able to share that information with your healthcare provider, which is really nice. Okay, so let's talk about body weight, whether we really want to or not. Now, this is a good thing to track. And thankfully, there are lots of options, a lot of options. So you can get talking scales on Amazon, you can get them from Walmart or Walgreens or pretty much any retailer who has an online presence. I don't know if they are available right off the shelf. Like, could you stroll into a store and grab one of these? But certainly you can do this online. The one I've chosen to highlight here is the Taylor talking scale, and it is going above and beyond. It doesn't just speak two languages, there are five. So there's English, French, German, Spanish, and Croatian, I believe. So that's a nice collection of languages. It does have a volume control. It's got large, high contrast numbers. They're about an inch high. So that's great. And the way the volume control works on this and other talking scales that have that kind of control is it's not a little knob that spins, rather it is a switch on the back of the scale, and you tend to have like low, medium, and high. So once again, just like with the talking thermometer, you can tell your smart assistant, log my weight. So you can get that weight read aloud and then speak to your assistant to log it if you like. For the connected body weight scale, I've chosen I never know how to say this. I think it's Y things, as in Wi-Fi, but it's kind of like withings. So in any case, this is a scale that will sync with your health app. It has its own app as well, and it will show not only your weight, but some of those other things that you might be tracking. How much water is in my body at this moment? What is my bone density? And as I say, visceral fat and muscle mass, things like that. It will track some trends and show you progress toward your goal. So if you are not really interested in doing the math, but you do want to know, is this trending in the direction that I'm hoping, or is it going in the other direction? This will tell you that in an accessible way. And much like with the thermometer, we could but will not be asking our smart assistant today to say, hey, so and so, what was my weight today? And it will give that information automatically. This is really nice in that the user doesn't have to interact with the app if they don't want to. It can simply be, I just want to step on the thing and have it sync to my phone and be done with it. That's totally fine. So, blood pressure is something that we certainly want to track, and it's something that we should be tracking whether or not there is a chronic health condition to monitor, because high blood pressure can be asymptomatic. So you might be feeling just fine and your blood pressure is incredibly high. So it's great that there are many options out there. And I have tested many of these just to try and find one that is both accurate and consistent, or at least one of those things. And so the one I'm highlighting here is the A and D. So that's the letter A and D as in Delta blood pressure monitor. It speaks in English and Spanish. It's got a large display. It can store up to 90 readings, which is great because right there on the device, whether you were, making note of your blood pressure each day or not, your talking blood pressure machine is doing that for you. And so you're going to be able to track those trends in a way that you might not be able to do with a talking thermometer, which doesn't often or always have a memory function. So you can, with some degree of confidence, then say to your provider, hey, this is what my numbers have been. I've reviewed them myself, and I know this is what my average is, that kind of thing. The connected option that I've chosen here is the Omron blood pressure monitor. There are multiple versions of this. For whatever reason, you have like a silver and a gold and a platinum and all of these things. So they all have different features in addition to being able to track your blood pressure. But the one that you bought the device for tracking the blood pressure, that's obviously going to be present in all of them. There are additional things that it can do, for example, detecting irregular heartbeat, giving you those trends over time, telling you, of course, hey, I didn't actually get a good reading. We need to do that again. That is possible with this. And it too syncs with the health app. And just like everything else we have talked about, you can tell your smart assistant to log your blood pressure if you've taken it, say, from that A&D device, and that will work. Or you can ask, hey, so-and-so, what was my blood pressure today? Or even what was my blood pressure on Wednesday? Or this morning, this evening? Because if you're taking it twice, you may want to know, I'd like to know what that first one was and what that other one was. Also, for both of these, they're going to let you know where your blood pressure is falling on the spectrum. So, in other words, this is low, this is normal hypertension stage 1 or 2 or any of that. So, even if you are not aware of what the numbers mean, and oftentimes they'll kind of color code things like this. And so now you've got that accessible way of knowing what those numbers mean as well. Oxygen saturation is another thing. And whether maybe you're on oxygen and you need to track that, or you have been ill, certainly with COVID, this was a big concern that oxygen saturation could be falling and you're not really aware of it. And so there are options for that. There's a talking one here. This one it's fairly small. I'd say it's about the size of 2 matchboxes, but I'm not great at the measurement side of things. And so the front, you've got this one button operation, so a singular oval button that you press, and then it's got a hinge that you can open, and you place your finger there inside it. So very, very simple. It does exactly what it says. It's going to measure the level of oxygen in your blood, and it's also going to give you your pulse rate. For a connected version of this, you might be looking at something that is multi-purpose, like a smartwatch. So most smartwatches now, depending on which version of it you have, so the older ones, say from 6 or 7 years ago, did not track this, but now you've got options that will track that on kind of a continuous basis, or it will do it when you're asleep, and then again if you prompt it. The nice thing about the smartwatches, like the Apple Watch, the Galaxy Watch, there's a Pixel Watch. So depending on if you're using iPhone or Android, there's going to be a nice smartwatch for you. And these will track things in addition to that oxygen saturation, and they will sync to your app. And so you'll be able to share that with your provider and review it yourself if you are familiar with operating your smartphone. Now, for some reason, as much as we could ask about our weight and body temperature and things like that, I have not been able to determine the magic words to get that information about oxygen saturation. So the last thing I want to talk about is blood sugar, and I don't want to go too in depth with this because there have been webinars from people who are experts in diabetes management who do a phenomenal job of this. But I do want to touch on what's out there so that you have some idea of what's available. So the talking option for this is the Prodigy Voice. It's kind of considered to be the gold standard in this space, and it isn't the only option, but it is the option which has been around for quite some time and allows you to not only get your blood sugar reading for that moment in time, but also then the date and time independently to review past readings to get an idea of what your average has been, which is incredibly important. And so while there are devices like the autocode, which is also by Prodigy, so the Prodigy autocode, it will speak that reading aloud, but the other functions on the device don't speak. So this one does store up to 450 readings. It will display that average over time and do all of the things that you would hope for your for your talking glucose monitor. There are continuous glucose monitors, which sounds amazing. And you're thinking, oh, yay, I would never have to do a finger stick again. Except it is really important to note that unlike the other things that we've talked about, where you could have either a talking option or a connected option, in this instance, you must have both. So if you're choosing to go with a continuous glucose monitor, you also need that talking backup to verify what the continuous glucose monitor is telling you. There have been false readings and even deaths because the user relied exclusively on that continuous glucose monitor. And for whatever reason, either the sensor unpaired or it gave an inaccurate reading that was not checked to verify with a traditional finger stick. So when you're guiding someone to choose something in this space, make sure that they are able to do both, able to do that finger stick. And as kind of a nice to have is this continuous glucose monitor. And the thing I want to mention about these is that there are two kind of primary companies who do this. And the way that you work with them is a bit different. So you have a sensor that you change every 14 days, and that sensor does need to be paired with your smartphone and the companion app in order to then start getting those readings from the sensor to where they belong in your health app and in the app for the monitor. The approach for each company, so we have the Freestyle Libre from Abbott and also the Dexcom line of products. And so the G7, I believe, is the latest there. With the Freestyle, you simply tap your phone against that sensor in order for it to connect. So it's using a bit of technology that is automatically making that connection when your phone is very nearby and has touched that sensor. And it's like, okay, we're good now. Very accessible, very quick and nice. The Dexcom line, on the other hand, has a 4-digit PIN for each sensor that you need to get from the sensor, the applicator, the box that it comes in, or there's a way that you can frame this little spot on the applicator, and the app automatically scans and says, oh, I see those numbers. If you're thinking that there's the possibility for difficulty, you are right, but there are ways to do this, whether you are asking for sighted assistance, you're calling someone like Be My Eyes or Ira, or you get that practice in, okay, I know exactly, it's always in the same place on this applicator, and I have learned exactly where to hold that camera and the lighting that I need in order for the app to scan it. Or again, maybe you're using your handheld magnifier or the magnifier on your phones, using the camera to get that 4-digit number. And so that is worth knowing, since you never know what insurance is going to allow for, or just a person's personal preference in terms of how the applicator works or how accurate they believe the device to be for them. So both of these do work. And once again, just reiterating that you've got to have that backup for these, because they can be unreliable. So you want to make sure that you have the ability to take that blood sugar reading when you need to. So just to wrap up here, I'd like to reiterate a couple of things that I talked about in terms of, what do you need to think about in terms of guiding someone to the right device for them? One thing, regardless of what device a person ultimately chooses, where possible, have that measured against a device in a clinical setting. And the reason for that is your device may be reading differently than what the device in the doctor's office reads. But if you can get consistent measurements, so in other words, you take your temperature and it still says, 96.8 every time you take it, and you're thinking, no, I know that's not right, but at least it's consistently measuring the same thing. And when you measure it at the doctor's office, it's saying 98.8. So okay, this device is not accurate, but it is consistently 2 degrees off. So knowing that is important, and also knowing if the person that you're working with does have that discernment to remember, okay, no, I'm not in hypothermia. It's just this is 2 degrees off. That's one thing to consider. The other thing is making sure that your user has a consistent and accessible way of keeping these records, whether that is something that is connected and the smartphone's sort of doing it automatically, or they're writing things down or taking notes on a digital recorder or brailing or whatever that happens to be. Can they track it, and can they review those results? So those are, I think, the important things to cover. There's a lot that we didn't talk about, which is exactly why we have a little bit of time anyway for questions. So if you're wondering about anything that I covered or didn't cover, we didn't touch on sleep machines, we didn't touch on medication management. There's a lot, but I would love to hear from all of you at this point. Any questions that you have?
This has been OIB-TAC's monthly webinar. Thanks for tuning in. Find recordings of our past webinars on our YouTube channel and discover all of our many resources at oib-tac.org. That's oib-tac.org. Like us on social media and share our resources with your colleagues and friends. Until next time.
The closing code is LTH. L as in Lima, T as in Tango, and H as in Hotel. LTH.